Hey folks, welcome to week 2 of summer session for gender and sexuality in Chicano communities. This week we'll be covering frameworks, pedagogy, and praxis. It's a little bit of a serpentine, windy journey, so we'll get through it. And what I've done is split the lecture into manageable chunks so that if you've got about 20-25 minutes here, 20-25 minutes there, we'll get through it and survive. Then again, I might just keep rolling into minute 45. Uh, all right. So, what I have here at the beginning of every week, along with the lecture materials, are the learning objectives. And from the syllabus, there are 4 listed throughout the course. And what these do is help me kind of stay grounded in the information I need to pass along to you as we develop our analysis. So, um, this week we're going to be hitting on 3 of the 4. You'll be able to describe how identities, including religious, gender, ethnic, racial, class, sexual orientation, disability, and/or age, are shaped by cultural and societal influences in context of equality and inequality. You'll be able to describe historical, social, political, and economic processes producing diversity, equality, and structured inequalities in the U.S. You'll be able to describe social actions which have led to greater equality and social justice in the U.S., i.e. religious, gender, ethnic, racial, class, sexual orientation, disability, and/or age. There's a 4th one in here that we don't quite hit on today, but that you're always kind of as an overarching dynamic because we're such a diverse class, as you can see from the introductions and the discussions that we've had. This one's kind of always with us, right? You'll be able to recognize and appreciate constructive interactions between people from different cultural, racial, and ethnic groups in the US. So aside from that being inherent in our dynamic, it's also inherent to Chicana feminism. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we progress in the course. But in summary, or to summarize rather, Chicana feminism didn't develop in a vacuum. And so a lot of that knowledge is intercultural, interdisciplinary, cross-cultural solidarity, especially amongst women of color. As a general agenda of sorts, what I have for us is kind of what I call my flow, right? And you see 4 kind of bigger topics up there in red: conocimiento, concientización, comadrazgo, and revolución. And for those of us who are not Spanish speakers in the course, because it's not a prerequisite, we will be code switching quite a bit. And when I do that, I'll go ahead and translate for us. So, conocimiento is really hard to translate with one word, but it's kind of building awareness. Consciousness would be the second one. Comadrazgo would be that sense of building community, but in a very particular way. And revolution would be the final word you have there. Not necessarily go out and create revolution in a radical sense, although you're welcome to do that, but revolution being change, right? Disruption of the norm. And so as we move along, we'll develop a larger sense of what these concepts mean, but I use them as my anchoring agenda item, so to speak. So when we're building a community, building awareness, we jump into the discussion forums, we remember that we are anchored in learning objectives. And then from there, we're committed to building awareness, expanding our knowledge base through the readings, through the lectures. Comadrazgo kind of becomes that space for connection and reflection. And then revolution being those examples in action. So as we move along, we'll be reading case studies without necessarily referring to them as such, but I will do my best to highlight examples in action. What is happening, not just throughout history, but today, right? Because I think the unfortunate part about some of my colleagues who are not Chicano studyists is that I'm actually curious to see how this has changed in the last year with the current state of affairs politically. But for a while, I've heard people say, well, Chicano studies is no longer relevant. And as someone who not just has a master's in Mexican American history, but someone who has worked in community for almost, let's just say for over 2 decades now, The relevancy of Chicano studies is totally on point, especially for this region. And a lot of the work that is being moved countywide, in terms of Santa Clara County, is anchored in all of the discussions we have in canons and disciplines like this. So, enough of that rumbling. Um, the other thing that I want to highlight is that, we tend to think of agendas, outlines, timelines as linear. And for the most part, when you think about it, it's circular because the learning never stops, right? We kind of go through this cycle of learning, and we're doing it throughout the course of 5 weeks. But learning is an ongoing process, right? And it ebbs and flows, and it kind of, you don't rinse and repeat, but you build, right? And so when I describe my classes, oftentimes I'll say it's like a snowball. You're packing the snowball, and at some point you're going to activate, do something with it. Hopefully, not throw it at me, but create some kind of change, make the world a better place. All right. We started off the discussions for the week anchored in this idea of living legacies. And I asked you in the forums to pay homage to the women in your lineage, right? If you really think about who you are and how you came to be, it it's a very unique kind of combination of events, right? Um, and a lot of folks leading up to whether we were created on purpose or not, that's a different conversation. Um, a lot of hopes and dreams, sacrifices, and wisdom have gone into our existence, right? We've been influenced by so many people. And if you look at history and how it's documented for the most part, we hear and we see and we learn about a lot of men. And women oftentimes are asked and expected to sacrifice space for others. It's almost obligatory. And so I wanted you to take some time and give the women in your lineage some space and some time and trust. My mom can frustrate the heck out of me. And so some of us, having worked with youth, are also very aware of how relationships with moms and mother figures and all of that can be complicated and difficult and sometimes painful. It's not always warm and fuzzy and tender and nurturing. But giving those women space, right, to exist as people in the fullness of their humanity by doing something simple like naming them. Um, because that's the other thing, right? I have 3 daughters of my own, and I think one of my proudest moments was when getting Mother's Day cards that are homemade and they say to Rosanna. And my mom thinks that's the weirdest thing. But there's something about folks being able to see you as a human being, complete with all of your, not just the good stuff, but the stuff that makes us human. So, anyway, giving women that space, and then also thinking about your own name, your full name, right? Your full name is a story if you think about it. Oftentimes when you ask somebody why or how did you get your name, there's a story. And even those of us that aren't aware of the story of our names, your name does speak to your particular story. My computer's waking up. Ignore that. All right, so connection, humanity, tenderness, memory, and remembrance. Naming has power, right? The names of our ancestors in particular bring us into a circle, so to speak. And then the nicknames themselves, they tell a story, they humanize us, they connect us, they bring us into that realm of remembrance. The maternal names, if you think about it as well, they often have a tenderness about them, especially in comparison to some of the names some of us have been called by other folks. And so, using myself as an example, the maternal figures in my life called me things like Little Roseanne, Rosanita, Chata, Chatita, very kind of tender, cutesy names. And then on the other hand, my dad, I feel warm and fuzzy about these too, but they're a little different, like hija de la chingada and cabrona and things like that I've grown to love in some kind of weird way, but not exactly the same tenderness. And for some of us, our dads are our maternal kind of nurturing figures. And we'll talk about that as we move on too. So, again, excuse me, again, this idea that naming has power. Some ongoing questions for consideration. You see that little systemic level, community level, institutional level, interpersonal level, intrapersonal level, these little target spheres here? What I draw from is the social ecology model. And when we're talking about things like how racism is constructed and how racism is experienced by many of us and how discrimination plays out, this becomes a useful tool to see the different spheres of where can we create change and how can we go about creating that change. And at the core of all of those spheres is really you, right? And so this is a pretty thorough model with some elaborations listed there at the systemic level, community level, institutional level, interpersonal level, and intrapersonal level for you to unpack as you see fit. Hit that pause button. But I do like to simplify things. And so when I talk about this in class, I tend to simplify it into three spheres. One is me, right? The interpersonal, we, and the wizard. And then I joke and I say, yeah, that's me at the center of Target. Not the $3 section, but the whole damn store, right? And that corny analogy aside, if you think about it, you're at the center. How do you reflect on biases that you hold, discriminatory kinds of thinking that maybe you're not even conscious of, but that you definitely have to work through and navigate daily in how you interact with other people. And that has an impact on that we sphere, right? The interpersonal. How are we relating to one another? How are we connecting or not connecting to each other? And then the third sphere, I call it the wizard, right? And that's that institutional, systemic, community sphere, where beyond an interaction with one other person, how is the entire community? How is the system? How are the institutions either upholding or challenging those practices that make life either more harmonious or more difficult, right? So the me, the we, and the wizard. And in your writing, I'll be super impressed if you address the three spheres when you're responding to a question about you, because you don't exist in solitude. As much as I love solitude, I know I don't exist in solitude. I'm always having to, for the most part, relate to one other person, connect with other people, sometimes by choice and sometimes not. Introverts in the group will understand that dynamic. And then we all got to go to work, we all got to go to school, we all got to go to Target and interact with folks and systems and institutions. So some questions for ongoing consideration as you really center your experience. How do you know what you know? How do those lessons about how you interact with the world get passed on? Who determines what we learn throughout our educational journey? What about the concept of educación? And that's not quite the same as education, so to speak. There's kind of this distinction between educación being more of that community sphere of learning, lessons that are passed down to you, values that are passed down to you, and a space beyond formal educational schooling institutions, right? And those formal educational schooling institutions would be education. So there's a distinction to be had there. So what about the concept of that? And then what is our relationship to power, community, traditional/formal education? Some of us have a hard time seeing how we're impacted by each of these. And oftentimes, my observation has been that those of us that have a harder time are those of us who in some way benefit, right, by way of our privilege. That can go about our day, go to Target and not have to encounter any type of discrimination. And I'll be honest, that is not my experience. I would load the kids up in the car, drive to Target, And by the time I've gotten to the $3 section in Target, we've had to navigate some ass backwards ways of being in the world, right? Including, okay, when you stop at a stop sign. I live in Gilroy. You can't just be like, what does the DMV little handy dandy manual say about who gets to go first when everybody stops there, at any given time? It becomes kind of a power trip. I swear I should record it one day because it's fascinating. But there are quite a bit of old school, sometimes not even low key racial dynamics out here that are fascinating as all hell. So by the time I get to the $3 section in Target, I've navigated the people on the road, I've navigated the people in the parking lot, whether or not I'm going to get followed by security. This has happened to me. And trust, it has happened to me in my Sunday best with my least chola parallel makeup. So again, all that rambling to say, what is our relationship to power, community, traditional and or formal education? Because those stories are not just anecdotal. When we're able to have a community that we're anchored in and have these conversations, we are able to trace those threads. And we're able to do things like hashtag me too. And we're able to say, it's not just me being paranoid or crazy or hyper sensitive because this is the stuff I study all day. It's real and unfortunate, and change is necessary. So self-analysis in that way is critical towards institutional change. So enough of that. Some of the defining terms that we're focusing on this week. In the forums, I've asked you to define Chicana. I've asked you to articulate your own identity as you see fit, and I've asked you to discuss the distinction between gender and sexuality. I want us to notice how we're defining Chicana in particular, because there's some fun stuff to be had here. I think in terms of how we make the distinction between gender and sexuality, you all are on point. You're juniors and seniors in the class. We'll still have that conversation because it is necessary as we move along. Right now, I'm going to focus on, excuse me, how we're defining Chicana. And what you see on the screen, straight up, is a screenshot from the dictionary online. And notice, right, the definition. In North America, a woman or girl of Mexican origin or descent. Now, if I had you in person, in a classroom, stuck with me for 45, 55, 65 minutes, what have you, I would say, all right, there's a difference between how we are defined by, let's just call it the mainstream, and how we see ourselves. And it goes back to that idea of zooming in on the lens, framing a picture, right? And in this case, I'm going to show some stuff on the screen here. Not that. We're going to go here. So, Chicana, right? That's where I grabbed the screenshot. And then all my life, I've kind of had to navigate this space of like, so you must be a chola. And I'm like, dude, I am so damn square. I can't say I don't know about the chola life, because come on, I grew up behind J.W. Fair, aka Bridges Academy in today's world. Went to Eastside Unified High School, Yerba Buena to be precise. But was I myself a chola? I was always like, no. I had cholas threaten me because I was supposedly the smart one. So I think I owe a lot of my academic success to my comadre Donna, who would straight up be like, no, you are not going to cut school. You are going to go to class. And then she'd throw in, a few bad words there and threaten me with violence. It was a little bit effective. But if we go back to this definition, Chicana, a woman or girl of Mexican origin or descent. And then we look up chola, a Latin American woman or girl with Indian blood, a mestiza. So I'm like, a woman or girl of Mexican origin descent, a mestiza. by definition, shook as all hell to discover that, according to the dictionary, I indeed am a chola. Um, and I had this revelation last semester, honestly. And that's not to say that I'm about the chola lifestyle. That's to say that that is very revealing in terms of how I am perceived by people in the world. And I'm not even going to make value judgments, right, about that lifestyle. But for those of us that are more familiar with that lifestyle, there is a distinction that the dictionary isn't quite capturing. But there's also something very telling and revealing in terms of how we are being defined. So the other thing that I love to do, because I am a visual artist of sorts, is to just let me see these jacked up algorithms of the Googlelandia, Google's little universe here, and see what comes up. So notice at the top here, what I'm searching is Chicana. And the images that come up, take a minute. Just think about, what are you seeing on the screen? What do these visuals imply? What is the connotation? Straight up, I swear I have a picture just like this. Probably took it at the same little photo spot. Just kidding. But again, what's the implication? What is the connotation? What is the association that is popping up into your mind? And maybe we don't all have the same sets of words and descriptions, but take a minute to notice what yours are. Let's scroll back up. And at this point, you can straight up hit the pause button and go do your own scrolling and searching. I had a student tell me once, well, that's your browser. Your algorithms are going to be particular to your search history. And I'm like, but bruh, I'm kind of doing this on the school computer where all kinds of people use it. So I'm just saying, this one is on my personal computer though. And I'll tell you, it's not looking that different. Although I will say, when I do a general search, some of these cool ones don't come up. All right, so now I'm gonna go over here into the Chola tab, and I'm gonna do the same thing, right? And even then, what are some of the stereotypes that you're noticing here? What are some of the visuals, some of the things that are popping up in your mind in terms of word association and whatnot? So briefly, I'm going to toggle back and forth between the Chicana screen and the Chola screen. And notice overlap, parallels, any distinctions. Kind of just take a minute and jot them down. And I'm going to not necessarily end, but I'm going to give us a break just so you can sit with that for a bit. Or not. I mean, you're totally free to hit the play on the next set of slides, but I'm gonna hit the pause button for that. And when we come back, be anchored in some of your own reflections, right? And what I'm asking you to do is also notice your own biases and stereotypes about Chicanas, about Latinas, about what that implies and what that means. And I know some of us have taken a few Mexican American studies courses here at San Jose State or elsewhere. And so we've had some elaborate discussions on this. And still, we also have a lot of dynamics that we navigate and negotiate with daily based on mainstream perceptions, based on stereotypes. So I also want you to take a minute to think about, what are the stereotypes that you grapple with as you navigate your daily life, right? From sun up to sundown. What are some of those stereotypes that impact you and your identity?